Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another free webinar from Smith School of Business. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm a business journalist here at Smith School of Business. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's free webinar from the Smith School of Business, Brave New Workplace. Today, we'll be discovering the 7 keys to productive, healthy, and safe organizations with our guest, Dr. Julian Barling. As always, today's webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. So before we get started with the presentation, I want to remind you that this session will be recorded. This is hands down the most common question we get. Yes, just by being signed up today, you're automatically going to get a link to the recording. So no, you will not be getting the slides. You'll be getting, in fact, a full recording of the presentation, and you are welcome to share that with anyone in your networks. And in fact, we encourage you to do that. So keep an eye on your inbox for that email. Today's format, we're going to have a formal presentation, and then our speaker will be taking your questions live at the end of the presentation. So if you want to ask a question, and I hope you will, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Today, we're going to have the chat button enabled so that you can converse with each other, but we also want to have the Q&A button reserved for asking those questions to the speaker. The more questions come in, the sooner, the better. And we're going to get to as many as we can as we go in the last 15 minutes or so of today's presentation. So today, it is my pleasure to introduce today's amazing guest speaker, Dr. Julian Barling, who I know is beloved by many of you in our audience today. Dr. Barling is the Borden Chair of Leadership and the Stephen Gima Distinguished University Professor at Smith School of Business. He's an authority on transformational leadership and has been named one of the 10 most influential leadership researchers in the world. Dr. Barling has received numerous awards for teaching and research. In 2002, he was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and received the National Post's Leaders in Business Education Award. Dr. Barling is an elected fellow of several international research societies and the author of over 200 research articles and 15 books, including The Science of Leadership, Lessons from Research for Organizational Leaders, and the forthcoming book from which today's content is drawn, Brave New Workplace. So with that, here is Julian Barling with Brave New Workplace.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you're all doing well. And I look forward to the webinar this afternoon on Brave New Workplace. I'm going to spend approximately the first 45 minutes just sharing some ideas with you about what it takes to design and build a wonderful, productive, healthy, and safe workplace. And for approximately the last 15 minutes, I hope to be able to share some thoughts with you based on your questions. So, to begin, as we're in and perhaps moving towards a post-pandemic workplace, understandably one of the hot topics that we've been dealing with in webinars since the start of the pandemic has been what work will look like after we emerge from this era. I fell into that trap myself at the beginning of the pandemic, delivering a webinar that I entitled, What Will Work Look Like When All of This Is Over? And therein, I think, lies the problem. It's already apparent that many, if not most, of our early predictions will prove to have been inaccurate and as a result unhelpful in planning for a post-pandemic era. Thus, this afternoon, instead of trying to predict what work will look like, I'm going to move in a different direction and outline what I believe, based on decades of research and practical experience working with organizations, work and workplaces should look like as we move into a post-pandemic era. As a personal aside, my research for about the last 4 decades has focused on the one hand, leadership, and at the same time, work and well-being. After I finished my book on leadership in about 2013, I started this project on work and well-being and lost steam, lost interest. In the first few months of the pandemic, I was sitting secluded in my basement working away when I suddenly realized I think most of what I had planned and what I'd learnt was really relevant in helping guide people planning a post-pandemic workplace. So I picked it all up again, and the outcome of all of that is the book Brave New Workplace and the ideas I'm sharing with you this afternoon. So just before we begin, a question. What is the evidence base for the Brave New Workplace? So the model that I'll be sharing with you, the model of productive, healthy, and safe work, builds on well-known social science theories and research that has been developed over the last 90 years and generated both in good times and in bad. It starts with the work of Marie Jahoda, a wonderful, wonderful person whose work on the Great Depression in the 1930s was fundamental and was still conducting research on work and well-being in the 1990s. If you have a commerce degree background, some of the names on the slide may be familiar to you. Certainly, most people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the term brave new workplace. If I can just spend a moment or two sharing some ideas about each of those three words. Firstly, what's brave about the brave new workplace? A comment I make in the introduction to the book is that moving toward productive, healthy and safe work is not for the faint-hearted. What requires bravery on the part of management is consciously choosing to step away from the status quo and do things differently. That's where bravery comes in the idea of a brave new workplace. What about new? Well, we all know the saying, the more things change, the more they remain the same. And I'm not sure if you realize that Bon Jovi would be part of the webinar, but certainly they incorporate that into one of their songs as well. But from a workplace perspective during the pandemic, two, I think, really important writers remind us that the more things change, the more they remain the same. Sarah Kessler, who wrote the book Gigged, notes that we've been worrying about the end of work for 500 years. And I think we can take from that, work is not going away. And Jeff Pfeffer, who's at Stanford and a wonderful commentator on work and leadership, pointed out that COVID changes everything and nothing about managing workers. The third element is the workplace itself and why focus on the workplace. To quote Christina Maslach, who is so well known for her research on burnout, if you're really going to try and make a dent in the problem and get to a better place, you're going to have to not just focus on the people and fix them. You have to focus on the job conditions and fix those as well. In sharing this comment, I'm not suggesting that changing working conditions is not difficult. Of course it is. But we all know from personal experience that changing people can be almost impossible. So, consistent with Christina Maslach, Brave New Workplace is going to focus on what are the optimal conditions to create a productive, healthy, and safe workplace. The model that I'm going to share with you this afternoon has 7 key elements: leadership, autonomy, belonging, fairness, growth, meaningful work, and safety. And there are 5 basic assumptions about how these will operate. I don't want to spend a long time on each of these. It's contained in the book. But I think fundamental to all of them is that small changes make a huge difference in the long term. We're not going to be talking about overturning the workplace. What we're going to be talking about are what are the smallest things you can do to have a meaningful impact on the way people experience their work. I think we'll realize that you don't need all 7 elements for a productive, healthy, and safe workplace. Some will be more important than others. But related to that is they're not best practices. They're all interrelated and mutually reinforcing. Just as one quick example of that, it's not going to give much benefit if you grant people autonomy without giving them training. In fact, that may be one of the most dangerous things you can do in the workplace. But similarly, it's not going to really help if you give people more training if you don't let them use what they've learned. Another assumption that underlies everything we'll be speaking about is the notion that we don't need separate elements for productive, let's say, versus healthy versus safe work. What works for one works for others, works for all of them. And I think for me, this has been one of the most important lessons I've learned in the last 40 years. This is important because you can go to many workplaces where people will tell you that what's needed to manage safety are a different set of management behaviors than perhaps what's needed to manage absenteeism. It turns out that's not the case, and we'll see that this afternoon. Most important, perhaps, is that we're not just helpless victims of current events. Instead, we now have the opportunity to re-envisage the nature of a post-pandemic work and workplaces, and that's where we're headed for this afternoon. So the first of the 7 key elements is leadership. Is it because it's most important? No. even though I've studied leadership for many decades, I know of no research that would suggest that leadership will have a greater impact than enhancing belonging or autonomy or meaning. So why start with leadership? Because somebody has to make the decision to re-envision the workplace. Somebody has to take that first step and say, we're no longer content about being just benchmarked against the others, but we're willing to do things differently. Over all these years, I've searched for what I would think is the best definition of leadership, and I think for me, it's expressed in a comment by Indra Nooyi, who was CEO of PepsiCo for many years. And her challenge is, please help others rise. Greatness comes not from a position, but from helping build the future. We have an obligation to pull others up. And if I can just make one or two comments on that, just think about this. Please help others rise. Leadership is not about seeming like the best person in the room or the most productive person in the room. Leadership is about helping everybody else in the room appear to be the most important person in the room. Your greatness doesn't come from your position or from your title, but from helping build the future, and we'll certainly talk about that this afternoon. And she ends by saying, we have an obligation to pull others up. I would just like to change that a little bit. We have a responsibility to pull others up. And in fact, we have a privilege of pulling others up. So just to share some thoughts about leadership, 2 fascinating studies have been conducted during the pandemic that can really help us rethink leadership in an important way. In the first study, Kayla Sargent and Alexander Statkovich showed that as of May the 5th, 2020, COVID-19 cases and deaths were significantly lower in US states that had female rather than male governors. Admittedly, this is still in the early stages of the pandemic, but if you look at these differences, they were profound. On the left-hand side of the screen is the number of cases until that date in female versus male-led states. And on the right-hand side is the number of deaths. And COVID deaths were almost 50% lower in states that were led by female governors. It's really good research. They controlled for whether they were Democrats or Republicans and the size of the state and the age of the governor and the amounts of experience. So we really can have a lot of confidence in these results. There seems to be a fundamental difference. And it's not just the United States. This effect has been replicated in a study of 194 countries by Garikapati and Kambampati, with female leaders having about half the fatality rate of their male counterparts. So it's not just in US states, it's in virtually every single country in the world in the early stage of the pandemic. The big question for us is why you would get these findings. So Sargent and Statkovich analyzed the transcripts from all the press conferences of 38 of these US governors. They couldn't get the other governors. And what it meant was they had over 2 million words to analyze. And their findings, I think, border on the profound. What they found was that female governors expressed more empathy than male governors. So in their press conferences, they showed a much greater awareness of other people's feelings, and they showed greater concern about people in their states, concerns about work and money, than did male governors. In addition, and I think contrary to what many people's stereotypical thoughts were, female governors expressed more confidence than did male governors. And I know the stereotype is that male governors or male leaders would show more confidence. But it was the female governors who expressed not just more self-confidence, but more confidence in the people in their state being able to do the right thing and help to overcome the problem. In their article, and whenever I discuss research, there's a URL at the bottom of the slide that can take you to the actual article. They give some of the statements just as examples. So here's 2 statements from male governors. It is imperative that individuals take personal responsibility by limiting their exposure. Contrast that with this comment from the governor of Rhode Island. I'm confident by working together and by sharing our best ideas, we will be more likely to get it right. A second statement from the governor of Washington, small acts are what wins wars. That's how you win wars. There are millions of small heroic actions. In contrast, the governor of New Mexico expressed empathy. This is painful that we have such grave economic losses and impacts. Incredibly painful. The question is, what are the implications of these findings? And I think that's where there are some wonderful leadership lessons. And for me, the implication is not we should just go out and, in crises, simply employ female leaders. I think the critical implications are for leadership development. I think that what these studies, what these findings are showing us is that empathy and confidence are critical, and we know they're not just the gifts of genetic inheritance. Instead, we know that they can be taught and learnt. And I think that's what we have to start to focus on in our leadership development initiatives. So just to sum up what we've been discussing about leadership, the first of the key elements, a lesson. And I end each of these with a lesson, which you can read more about them in the book. But I think the leadership lesson from all of this is, what are the smallest things you can do to help others rise in their worst possible moments? And I think that's the essence of leadership in times like this. Moving on to autonomy. Autonomy would be the second of the 7 key elements. And I start by asking a question. If we're all in the room, I'd ask you to raise your hands or whatever. But do you agree with the comment or the statement that no one knows the job as well as the person who does it? And based on my experience working with executives like yourselves, what I've learned is when you challenge people with this question, virtually everybody agrees with it, which is interesting because when you look at the data, what it turns out is that many people have a lot of difficulty in giving autonomy away, in giving up control and letting the people who know the jobs the best actually take responsibility for the job. This becomes incredibly important, I think, during a pandemic and in a post-pandemic era. If you think about many of the major issues confronting organizations right now, control over workload, work schedule, work pace, and perhaps particularly the place of work, have never been as important. I think what makes it even more important is that right now what we have is more and more people working from home who wish they could be at work. But at the same time, more and more people working from work who wish they could work from home. And underlying all of this is the issue of autonomy. I think that's what we're confronting when we speak about work from home programs. At the same time, in the background, looming really large, as more and more people demand the right, if we can say, to work from home, there's been a predictable interest by management in monitoring and controlling people who are working from home. At the end of 2020, this was seen in a controversy that certainly made an appearance in many media, where software from Microsoft 365 was used to monitor individual productivity scores of people working from home without their knowing. So autonomy is a critical issue right now. A study by Toby Wall and colleagues from 1990 shows us just how important autonomy can be. In their study, which took place in an advanced manufacturing site, they had 3 different phases. So in the first phase, which lasted 50 days, they had a system called specialist control. Anything goes wrong with your equipment, you call your supervisor, who's a specialist, and your supervisor comes to fix your equipment. Everybody then had 20 days of training in group problem solving and so forth, and they moved to an operator system. And in the operator system, if your equipment malfunctioned, you had 15 minutes to try and fix it yourself. And the fear on the part of management was that if they moved towards the system, productivity would go down. What were the results? The precise opposite. As people took more responsibility, productivity went up, downtimes went down, and these effects increased over 12 months. So what they saw was, despite fears by management that if you grant people more autonomy, performance may go down, what they saw was a decrease in feelings of job pressure and an increase in well-being and feelings of work satisfaction and productivity as well. What are the implications of this? I think the lesson is that even small changes in autonomy can have a major effect on work performance, health, and safety. And I think out of this right now, there's a tremendous lesson for organizations and organizational leaders who are confronting decisions about remote working. Once people have been granted the right to work from home or even sent to work from home, taking away the autonomy to choose where they work right now might well have significant negative effects on work performance, health, and safety. We shouldn't just be considering the place of work right now. What we need to be focusing on is people's experience of the autonomy they have over important aspects of their work. Belonging is the third element of a productive, healthy, and safe workplace. And I think belonging, again, is critical at a time when organizations are struggling to reimagine what remote work means and what hybrid teams mean. Some idea of the importance of belonging comes from the well-known Gallup survey on what makes a great workplace. So feel free to Google Gallup organization, what makes a great workplace. And they identify 12 factors that go towards making up a great workplace. Item number 8 for them is, I have a best friend at work. Whenever I mention this in organizational talks and so forth, you get some people raising eyebrows, and particularly about the notion of a best friend at work. But surprisingly, this item in Gallup survey after Gallup survey with different organizations turns out to be the best predictor of employee engagement. Because of people's concerns about the word best, what they did on a trial basis was they removed the word best. So the item was just, I have a friend at work, and it was no longer the best predictor of employee engagement. So really, we're talking about a really close friend. They could also play with their data. They found that on average, about 20% of people would endorse the item and say, yes, I have a best friend at work. So they calculated what would happen if 60% of people endorsed this item, and they could show in such situations there would be 36% fewer workplace safety incidents. Engagement scores would go up, customer engagement scores would go up by 7%, and company profitability would be 12% higher. So we should not underestimate the notion of belonging and feelings of belonging at work. For too long, however, organizations have focused solely on developing instrumental work relationships. But what we know is that feeling that we belong to something bigger than ourselves should never be underestimated. And based on some really interesting recent research, I think what we should now start to do is focus on what's being referred to as multiplex relationships at work. A multiplex relationship is simply a relationship that has a high quality work and personal relationship with the same individual. Why are these important? Well, if we think of the type of issues that are important in teamwork, think about sharing information, think about difficult conversations. Teamwork is reliant on sharing information and so forth, but you're most likely to be willing to do that with somebody who you would regard as a best friend. Evidence for this comes from one study in a financial organization that should also be quite reassuring. What they showed in the study is that we don't need too many, numerous multiplex ties with others in order to achieve the workplace benefits of multiplex ties. In fact, what they could show is, on average, about 7 multiplex ties is what you need. Fewer than that, and there probably aren't enough to generate the benefits. But intriguingly, more than about 7, the benefits start to wear away, possibly because it's difficult to maintain that number of high-quality social and personal relationships. So I think what we're learning when it comes to belongingness in the workplace is that we need to develop more than just instrumental work-related relationships. I think organizations have appropriately focused energy, effort, resources, and so forth on teams, but they've limited themselves to the work-related aspects of teams. I think the more recent research evidence is suggesting it's time to go beyond and to encourage the interpersonal aspects as well. Fairness. Fairness is the fourth of the 7 elements, and perhaps no better to start than with a comment by Eamon de Valera, the Irish Prime Minister in 1945, who is famous for having said, "It is indeed hard for the strong to be just to the weak." If that's the case, how do people respond to being treated unfairly at work? And for me, the classic study is one conducted by Gerald Greenberg. It was conducted in the late 1980s in a manufacturing company in the Midwest of the US that had 3 geographically separated plants. The company that Greenberg could work with was facing a situation where they were going to lose contracts for a short period of time in 2 of the 3 plants. And what they decided to do, instead of having mass layoffs, was that everybody in those 2 plants would take a short 10-week pay cut. That's everybody, including the vice president of the plant. So one plant experienced no changes in payment because they had no changes in their contract. To avoid layoffs in the other 2, they both received a 15% pay cut for the 10 weeks, but they treated them differently. So one of the companies was what they refer to as the inadequate explanation site. They had a 15-minute meeting, and they were only informed that the lost contracts had made the pay cuts necessary. The other one was what they called the adequate explanation site. They had a 90-minute presentation. The presentation was the same, but they were allowed to ask as many questions as they wanted, and explanations were provided in detail. So they both suffered a pay cut, but the one was treated slightly better than the first one. And the outcomes were incredibly different. So employee theft increased, but did not increase in the same way in all 3 plants. For the 10 weeks before the announcement was made, employee theft, as you can see on the left-hand side of the graph, was the same in all 3 plants. But during the 10-week period, employee theft differed dramatically in the 3 plants. In the plant in which there were no pay cuts, employee theft was at the same level. For the plant that received the adequate explanation, employee theft increased, and increased significantly. But for the plant that experienced the inadequate, the unfair treatment, employee theft increased dramatically. And it wasn't just employee theft that was affected. They could show the same effects for voluntary turnover. During the 10 weeks in which the pay cuts were in effect, 12 of the approximately 48 people in the inadequate explanation plant voluntarily resigned from work. It seems as though there's a limit to how unfairly people are willing to be treated before they choose to exit themselves. But I think we can also see how quickly behaviors deteriorate when employees feel that they're faced with unfairness. And just as remarkably, we can see how quickly regular behaviors are restored when people think that fairness is restored. And if you just go back to consider what we're talking about, they both received the same amount of pay cut, but the one received a more detailed explanation than the other group. The lesson from this, which I find bordering on the profound, is that people are remarkably sensitive to the way in which they are treated and will respond accordingly. If I was to give you all a t-shirt, I'm not, but if I was to give you all a t-shirt, on the front it would say, people are remarkably sensitive to the way in which they're treated and will respond accordingly. The 5th of these 7 key elements is the notion of growth and development. And employees have always viewed the workplace as a place that offers them potentials for growth and development. In the same Gallup survey that I referred to earlier about I have a best friend at work, of the 12 items that Gallup generated that predict whether people will think that it's a great workplace, 3 of the items deal with growth and development. And if you look at them, they don't really require much from an organization. There is someone at work who encourages my development. Not even every day. In the last 6 months, someone at work has talked to me about my progress, and this last year, I've had opportunities at work to learn and to grow. People want to feel that they are developing and growing, at and through their work. So the ideas that I'd like to share with you about growth and development really get to something that is almost a part of the DNA of organizations, and that is feedback. Feedback has, I'm going to use the word, always been seen as a major opportunity for growth and development, and again, integral to most organizations. But what if feedback is not as useful as we might think or as we might want? Haley Blunden and a group of colleagues at Harvard conducted 6 studies that I think are going to get us to rethink the role of feedback in organizations. So in their first 2 studies, what they showed is when employees want developmental input, in other words, when they want actionable forward-looking suggestions from their managers, they typically approach their managers and ask for feedback. But when managers hear feedback, what they offer is a review of past performance. And when they do that, it's often seen by employees as being backward-looking, critical, and not useful. So in studies 3 to 6, they turn the focus. And what they do in study 3 to 6 is they find that when managers were asked to provide advice on performance tasks rather than feedback, employees were now significantly more likely to receive developmental comments and suggestions and feel that the comments were actionable and helpful. It seems as if the notion of feedback sends us to look to the past when growth and development are really all about the future. So what I learned from this is that the best leaders continually look to building a better future, and what the challenge is to make feedback a part of that. And I look forward to the day when organizations schedule what I'm going to start to call their regular 360-degree advice sessions with employees. I think a small change like that can reorient how we think of and operate within the notion of growth and development at work. The 6th element is all about meaning and meaning at work, and I'd like to start with a short story that was told to me by a wonderful MBA student many years ago who had taken over a healthcare pharmaceutical plant near Toronto. And one of the functions in this plant was they had a small production line where they manufactured intravenous drips for infants. On his first day at work, he walked around this big plant, just asking people what they did. He stopped at somebody on the line, a young woman who was working on the assembly line, and asked her what she did. And her response was, "Oh, we save babies." And I think that's really important. If you feel you save babies, I think the motivational problem at work is over. So he was intrigued. Where would she get this notion about we save babies? And he went and he found that a prior supervisor had organized that one day there were school buses available when people got to work. They all went down to the hospital for sick kids and walked around in the morning and saw that actually what they did at work saved babies. And the question is, what does it take to make work meaningful to people? Stories abound, but I would like to share with you just one study that was conducted in the COVID era, in the earliest days of the pandemic, in Chengdu in China, in an ICU, when you can just imagine things were particularly frantic. And what the study involved, remarkably, was just an email from the manager of the ICU unit to the people working in the ICU unit. And what I'd like to do is share with you really the minimal amounts of information that employees received. So let's go. As a COVID-19 ICU health worker, you're making a significant contribution to the hospital's goal of providing excellent medical services under the current circumstances. Without your unwavering contribution, our hospital would never have received so much appreciation and recognition. Your talent and caring manner are a credit to and pride of our hospital. Undoubtedly, our hospital's future development and success will continue to rely on your hard work and dedication. You have given your utmost effort to take great care of every patient and have demonstrated your exceptional medical skills. Your compassion and humility are always impressive. Our patients and their families are very grateful for the differences you have made in their lives. They call you and other ICU healthcare workers angels sent by God on earth because you have saved patients' lives and preserved their health. Human life is so invaluable that your work truly deserves such beautiful praise. Undoubtedly, and then you can read this briefly as we continue. This is all they received. I left out a few words where the dots are. This is all they received. And 2 weeks later, what they found is it had changed behaviors. What they call taking charge behaviors, proactivity, are critical in an ICU, and perhaps even more critical at the start of the pandemic when there was so much uncertainty. And taking charge behaviors increased by 29% as rated by supervisors in the group that received this email. And that was contrasted with a group of people working in the same conditions who never received the email. And work engagement, as reported by the employees themselves, increased by 10%. I think that it's quite plausible that you can say that, but people know how important their work is. It turns out that we cannot take anything for granted. I think the leadership lesson is we shouldn't take anything for granted. From this study and from others, I think what we learn is we need to remind people how important their work is, especially in their toughest moments. And it gets back to the definition of leadership. It's to help people rise in their worst possible moments. The last of the key elements is safety. And again, the basic need for workplace safety has long been an issue for employees. If you're a movie buff, go back and watch Charlie Chaplin's 1936 Modern Times. Occupational safety was an important issue then. Safety is one of Maslow's so-called basic needs. And I think the COVID pandemic has exposed the precarious nature of workplace safety for us. Here's just one statistic. By April 2021, that is a year after the outbreak of the pandemic in the United States, 3,607 healthcare workers had died from COVID-19 in the first year of the pandemic. If you look at the safety data from the US, that means that just based on healthcare workers, that's excluding manufacturing workers from food plants and so forth, the annual rate of safety fatalities in the States will have more than doubled in the first year of the pandemic. So the pandemic exposes just how precarious occupational safety is. Just to give some context about how important safety is, let me just share these three sets of data from you. So this is actually the murder rate in Canada between 1993 and 2019, and let's just say it varies around about 600, and I think most of us would say that's pretty unacceptable. 600 people dying from murder in Canada each year. So let me overlay on top of that the number of people who killed at work each year, and it's a lot more. It's about 30 to 40 to 50% more depending on the year. So more people die at work each year in Canada in those same years than are killed or murdered in Canada. Occupational safety, occupational fatalities seems to be almost the best kept secret in organizations, but for many employees, it's a living reality. What gives me real hope and at the same time incredible frustration is the third set of data that I'll overlay, and that is traffic fatalities in Canada. And what gives me considerable hope is look at the dent that we've made as a society in the number of traffic fatalities from 1993 through till 2020. And I think it shows us just what we can achieve when we get serious as a society. And what we're primarily talking about, of course, is the public health campaign against drinking and driving. If we want to, I think we can make a substantial dent in the problem of workplace safety in Canada. So a study that I think will show what we can start to do. It was conducted in UK manufacturing firms, and Nick Turner and his colleagues had access to data, very detailed data. So detailed interviews with senior managers who were responsible for each of the 5 HR practices that I'll share in the next slide. They also interviewed shop floor employees in each of the manufacturing companies and written documentation, for example, about training schedules, selection, and so forth. And the injury data were independent and were collected from the UK Health and Safety Executive, the government agency that keeps the data. The 5 HR practices that they looked at: systematic selection, extensive training, performance appraisals, high relative compensation, so compensation would be high relative to other companies, and empowerment, we would use the term autonomy. And what they showed was that when you put all these together, it was only empowerment or autonomy that predicted safety, injuries in the organization, and they could quantify the effect. They could show that all else being equal, an increase of just 1 point on the empowerment scale was associated with a 54% decrease in the injury rate. What's being asked for in this model of productive, healthy, and safe work is not that we make massive changes, but the challenge is, what are the smallest things we can do to change workplace conditions that will have a meaningful difference? So the lesson from all of this, the implications, we often go into organizations, and what we have from management is that safety is so important that we cannot afford to give up control to others. But I think the lesson from research is that safety is so important that we can no longer afford not to grant employees more autonomy over how they do their work. That's certainly where the data are pointing us. So some concluding comments, and then I look forward to your questions and some discussion about productive, healthy, and safe work. A wonderful comment attributable to Warren Buffett: only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked. And from an organizational perspective, I think the tide went out when COVID-19 hit. I think we began to learn just how many organizations had been swimming naked in terms of the policies, practices, procedures, and so forth in these organizations. I think we face two critical challenges as we move toward productive, healthy, and safe work in a post-pandemic era. The first challenge for me is that women and members of historically disadvantaged groups have been disproportionately hurt by the pandemic, but have been treated differently in organizations for so long. I think what the challenge that we're facing now is to ensure that productive, healthy, and safe workplaces benefit all their members, that we don't have status hierarchies and certain privileged groups, but we move to a situation in which all members of organizations share equally in the opportunity for productive, healthy, and safe workplaces. And in moving to that environment, in moving to that, I think, wonderful opportunity, I think the challenge is, what are the smallest things we can do going forward to build those workplaces? Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julian, for that fantastic presentation. And thank you, audience, for your remarkable engagement in the chat. That was really fun to see you all conversing. We have some really excellent questions from the audience. I'm hoping more will come in. We have until 2 o'clock to work through the questions. Julian, I want to start with a pretty high level question, which is, if someone from an organization wanted to move their company in the direction that you're indicating to make a healthy, a safer workplace, what's the best place to begin? Like, how do you start?
Okay, that's a great question. And it's really a transition question. I mean, that's what will sort of get us moving in the right direction. And I would say, fortunately, there is nothing that suggests that there is one best place to start. I think it's going to depend on the organization's culture, the organization's resources. Just getting started, I would suggest, maybe the most important thing the organization can do. So think about which of these 7 factors is most relevant to where your organization is right now, or your team. You know, it might not be an organization-wide intervention. Perhaps this is something about your team. Perhaps it's something that you can do personally as a leader. But as I try and imply by discussing leadership first, just starting somewhere is the leadership initiative that might be the best thing that you can do.
Got it. Okay, thank you. I'm going to now, let's see, Tess Kerner writes to us regarding leadership, I'm curious if other factors like ethnicity and lived experience of these governors, this is your early example with the governors in the US during COVID, male and female, were considered in the study of how governors fared in the number of deaths in the pandemic. Intersectionality plays a huge role in how people engage and lead. Any response for Tess?
Sure, I'll give a sort of a technical answer and then a broader answer. The technical answer is both in that study on US governors, as well as in the subsequent study on 194 countries. The researchers were careful to take into account factors such as the size of the state or the size of the country, whether the state was governed by a Democrat or Republican, the ethnicity of the leader, and so forth. But what they do statistically is they control for those factors, they remove them. The question that Tess raises is fundamental. Intersectionality is really important from a leadership perspective, both from the leader's own status, but as well as from that of employees. I think in the organizational sciences, we've been late in coming to the table in trying to understand the influence of the experience of leader intersectionality. It's changing. It was not addressed directly in those studies, but I think that we're starting to see a change in leadership research.
Okay, great, thank you. That was did you want to also give us a broader response? You're good. Thank you. Susan Scott writes, I totally agree with the notion of autonomy in the workplace, but that might mean people have some kind of autonomy in their work. What advice or comments could you make for workplaces where employees don't have as much control, I'll say in their workday, for example, working in retail, grocery, sometimes healthcare? People can't work from home necessarily. So how can managers provide or offer more autonomy to these kinds of employees?
So a couple of responses to that. So the first is, I don't think that allowing people to work from home is the only way of offering autonomy. In fact, what we know from Stats Canada data through the pandemic is this image that newspapers may create that's like everybody's working from home is simply not the case. Even now, the majority of people are not working from home. And that's even that's even taking into account that we're not talking about working permanently from home. So most people don't work from home most of the time. Paradoxically, you may have more room to move as a leader or an organization with people who have less control right now, because there's a greater opportunity for you to step in, such as retail workers and so forth, who obviously have to go to work. Where to start? I think one of the best ways to start sometimes, and it's quite hard for leaders because I can understand the fear of losing control, is sort of, don't ask me, ask them. And I think that from my experience, if you do ask the employees themselves, well, firstly, why don't managers ask employees themselves? I think they're afraid that the answer they're going to get is, that you have to offer so much control that, in a sense, they're asking you to literally give away the store. Yet my experience is that's not what they're going to do. They're going to ask for small, meaningful increments in job-related control. So don't be tentative. Speak to them, ask them. And I think what we learned from that study in manufacturing in the UK is even the smallest increases in autonomy, giving people 15 minutes to fix their own equipment, can have meaningful short and long-term effects. So right. Don't be tentative on this one.
Okay, it's interesting, because while you were we were listening to your presentation, people were chatting, and what came up a few times is people suggesting that maybe this was the end of managers. Really, if we could just give autonomy to the workers, do we need the managers? And you're saying no, that's not the case.
So it's definitely not the case. Management, and I'm deliberately differentiating between management and leadership. Management is not about giving control away. Totally. I think that is like laissez-faire, passive, do-nothing management. I think that if I can quote from the book by Phil Jackson, 11 Rings, the book's called 11 Rings. He concludes that book by saying that leadership is about the art of giving away control. It's about how much to give, when to give, and so forth. It's very nuanced.
Right.
I think that what we have to be mindful of in doing this is that you can give away too much control. We know from research, and I discuss this in the book, that actually people can have too much autonomy. We can give people so much responsibility that it becomes a stressor and it depletes their health and it interferes with their performance. I think the challenge is, what are the smallest things you can do to make, in terms of autonomy, to make a meaningful difference in their work lives, and no more.
Right. That's fantastic. Thank you. Gosh, the questions are coming in now. Thank you, audience. From Anna Scara, can you please provide some insight on potential improvements to working conditions and reducing burnout in healthcare settings where work from home options are not feasible?
That's a really sort of relevant topical question. And unfortunately, if you look at Canada, if you look at the UK, and so forth, it's a very politicized question. There are so many places where I think you could start. But I think if you just take burnout as an example, and the classic view of burnout, that it starts with feelings of emotional exhaustion, and the emotional exhaustion leads to feelings of being depersonalized at work, and that's what hurts your productivity. The question is, how can we initially stop those feelings of emotional exhaustion? I know politically, governments, etc., seem to think the answer may be just more money or whatever. But I think that any one of these factors that we discussed, research tells us can have a feeling of, any one of these factors that we discussed can help prevent feelings of emotional exhaustion. Autonomy. I know it sounds counterintuitive to suggest that giving people more autonomy may reduce emotional exhaustion, but essentially that's what the research tends to show us, increasing feelings of belonging. The study that I mentioned on meaningfulness at work, conducted in China at the beginning of the pandemic, was conducted on nurses. So reminding nurses how critical their work is actually helped with engagements, it helped with taking charge behaviors. So it's these small things that we can do that are going to help.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. To the question of safety, Catherine Fox writes, do you believe these safety findings also apply when we consider psychological safety in the workplace?
Absolutely. So in the book and in the presentation, I spend more of my time on physical safety, not at all because psychological safety is unimportant. It is definitely important, but there is a lot of writing, there's a lot of thought, there's a lot of work going on about promoting psychological safety. That is simply not the case in the organizational areas, in organizational research for physical safety and physical health at work. But I think that the findings that we've got from physical safety would overlap in terms of promoting psychological safety at work.
Okay, great. And just we're getting some notes here. What book is Julian referring to? Julian?
Okay, so I've just published a book called Brave New Workplace. I note that on Amazon it's finally available on the 31st of this month. And the publishers just released it, Oxford University Press. Everything was affected by the pandemic. So just a small little personal story. The book was due to come out last July and has been delayed by supply chain issues. Publishers have found it incredibly difficult to get hold of the paper, the quality of which they need for books. So even publishing books was impacted by the pandemic.
My goodness. Okay, so there's your plug. Brave New Workplace, available on Amazon beginning January 31st. Of course, it's my duty to remind you to consider ordering it from your local independent bookstore. A very interesting question from Shamiso Simango. In a post-knowledge era, what decisive actions and emotional convictions would you like to see from leaders?
Sorry, can you just repeat that one?
In a post-knowledge era, what decisive actions and emotional convictions would you like to see from leaders?
So that's an incredibly interesting question. Incredibly challenging.
Complicated. Where to begin? You could do this, Julian.
The post-knowledge era. So I would go all the way back to the beginning of the presentation and go to Sarah Kessler's comment that we've been worrying about the end of work for 500 years. We've been worrying about the changing nature of work for 500 years. Every single time we seem to have one of these incredibly large threats to our working environment. We're concerned about, we have to redo everything. And I think we can go back and see that that's just not the case. My guess is, and I'm going to provide a short, simplistic answer, I think we're going to need more of the same, a little more of the same. So I think that the more things change, the more we need to get back to the basics. It's still going to be people who do work. The nature of work may change, but people's nature does not change. People still, in a sense, crave to see their belongingness needs full, to feel that their lives are meaningful, and so forth, even if the nature of work has changed. So just a quick comment that's a little bit off the point that I think is relevant now. Lots and lots and lots of media attention about how work is going to change with ChatGPT.
Yes.
How academia is going to change. So I'm old enough to remember the threat that seemed to be posed when we started to get handheld calculators at the beginning of the 1970s. And there were these dire predictions about how education is over because people have a machine that can do all these calculations for them and so forth. And within a short period, what we saw was that education became deeper, became more sophisticated. We learned more. We could ask more of our students. But people remained the same. People were still people. And I think we're going to see the same as we move forward.
That's really interesting. Thanks for bringing in ChatGPT, because I think that's on a lot of people's minds, including mine as a person who writes for a living. A question from Raya Mukherjee regarding work from home. There's an overarching tone or belief that those who take the work from home position will be passed over for promotions in favor of those who return to the premises. The notion of out of sight, out of mind can be detrimental to firms and to workers, as the talent pool to consider for promotion would be very small. Is this true? And if so, what suggestions do you have for leadership to remove this fear and level the playing field?
I think it's an incredibly realistic fear. Whether it's true or not, I think we'll know that in the years to come when we have better data to see if it's actually the case. Is it a very realistic fear? Yes, it is. Should we be concerned about it at a time when some organizations seem to be doing whatever they can to try and force people back to the office? Perhaps those who do go back to the office will be favored. I think the challenge for management, for leadership right now, is not about forcing people back into what is going to turn out to be, let's call it, an old-fashioned pre-pandemic model. I think the challenge for management and leadership right now is to re-envisage, to reimagine what the new workplace looks like. And part of that new workplace is how do we spot talent with people working from home? The old methods of if you can't see it, it can't be happening, I think it's just outmoded. The challenge to us now is to appreciate this more nuanced workplace and rise to the occasion.
Right. Okay. That's great advice and lots to think about. Audience, we're out of time. We've got so many more questions. Before you all leave, I want to put in a plug for a really exciting next, if you're interested in Julian's content and looking at the chat, it looks like lots of you are going to go and buy the book, which is fantastic. I do want to let you know that Smith School of Business is going to be releasing a multi-part podcast series with Dr. Barling. So Julian, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, it's going to start in February. There will be 4 or 5 sessions where Alan Morantz and I discuss different topics from the book and how they apply to the workplace. Okay, so you can all have the pleasure of bringing Julian Barling into your home and your
in through your earbuds, and it will be a more in-depth discussion, I think, than what we're able to manage today. But Julian, thank you so much for today. It's really fantastic information. I know our audience has been most appreciative. Before I wrap things up, I do want to let our audience know, as I always do, that we have some educational opportunities coming up through Queen's Executive Education. I want to let you know about this particular program, in part because, Julian, you're going to be teaching on this one, I believe. Transformational and Charismatic Leadership, a program that will help participants understand the behaviors involved in transformational leadership and to know how to use these behaviors to enhance their leadership presence. And this is in person, yes?
Yes.
In person in Toronto. It'll be held in both March and in October at Smith Toronto. So for more information, there's the URL, smithqueens.com/exec-ed. And then again, I always let you know that our next free webinar through Smith Business Insights will be coming up on February 16th, which is a Thursday. It's called How to Boost B2B Sales by Cutting Complexity. Your special presenter will be Jim Hamilton. So that should be really a lot of fun. Julian, thank you so much for being such an esteemed guest, such a great presenter. Thank you to our audience for being so attentive and so engaged in the content. And I wish you all a good rest of the day. Thank you on behalf of Queen's University and from Smith School of Business for your attendance, and we will see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.